In Inconvenient Memories, her debut book published in English, Chinese author Anna Wang chronicles life in China before, during, and after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. Anna describes her life and events with such acute detail that we experience what she did, and we have the benefit of Anna's painstaking analysis as well. I wonder if some of the contradictions Anna describes in post-Tiananmen Square China, opening up and invigorating its economy while tightening political control, aren't eerily mirrored in the U.S. today. Anna Wang is my guest. I'm Alice Bloom. This is A Town in Village 2. Welcome back. Anna, thank you so much for being my guest today. Now, we're speaking to each other across a continent. You're in California and I'm in New York. I hope it's a little cooler there than it is in New York today. Let's start out with a question about what China was like coming out of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, the period from 1966 to 1976, when Mao died.
Yeah, it's a very chaotic time. And in my book, I described what I saw from my perspective. From the founding of the People's Republic Republic of China in 1949 up to the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, China had been under this strict, controlled, planned economy. So marching into the 1980s, the Chinese government realized that the planned economy wasn't sustainable. So they began experimenting a market economy, but they couldn't get rid of the planned economy altogether because they still had this idea of how a socialist country should operate. So China entered a period of mixed economy, which market economy and the planned economy coexisted. And this market economy, for a short period, it increased the people's living standard, but it also brought about inequality, corruption, and inflation. And I think people were frustrated by this inequality and corruption.
Sure. So, now, you also say that people were living in famine and tremendous insecurity.
Yeah.
And they always had to watch what they were saying. Tell me briefly what you mean by a planned economy.
Yeah, planned economy means we worked the same amount every day, and we got supplies distributed by government equally. So that's basically what planned economy did to people. So in the 1970s, even though people were poor, but at least we were equally poor. So that brought us some comfort. So that's, do you remember I described my grandmother's apartment building? It's like a long corridor with 30-something rooms arranged on both sides. So in the 1970s, the doors of the rooms were left open almost every day except when people slept. So we were like a big happy family, and people like to share. If I didn't have salt when cooking, I could pretty much go to every neighbor's house to borrow some. That's because we were equally poor. But in the 1980s, because of this emerging market economy, some people got rich, but some people were still poor. So people began shut their door. So the corridor was pitch black even in the day. That's because the rich people didn't want others to know what they had, and the poor people didn't want others to know what they didn't have. So I think that's quite shocking for me how people responded to this newly emerged market economy.
So people who were formerly one family now experienced a lot of tension and jealousy and competitiveness.
Yes, yes.
Let's talk for a minute about describe what Mao's vision of the world was. He said he had three classes of countries.
Yeah, yeah. He has this theory. The countries divided into three classes. The first class is United States and Russia, and the second class is like Canada, New Zealand, and a wealthy country in Asia like Japan. The third class is all the poor countries in Latin America, in Africa, and China, he thought belonged to the third class.
And why did he decide that? Was it a political decision?
Yeah. So that's why I was frustrated at first because when I was little, I was taught constantly by the teachers that China was the greatest country in the world, and this theory was brought about in the 1970s, I think. So when I first heard this theory, I was shocked because I was always thought that uh, I was the luckiest person in the world because China was a great country and we are the happiest kids in the world. But suddenly, I was told that China belonged to the third class. So I didn't get the theory, but my teacher explained that China China was still great, but we voluntarily associated us with the poor countries. That's because we want to unite and accomplish this communist goal. So that's why we want to unite together with
and get better and
yeah,
improve things.
yeah.
All right, let's start to talk a little bit about the Tiananmen massacre. Tiananmen wasn't the first protest. Students had been protesting at the university for some time.
Yeah.
So, what are the events that contributed to the culmination in the Tiananmen Square massacre? What was it like? I know there were protests about elections, students took to the streets. There was a student beaten to death in 1988.
Yeah.
But you also said that insecurity contributed to the protests as well. Explain what you mean about that.
Yeah. I have explained that how the general public felt frustrated and they had this sense of insecurity. And on top of that, college students had their own anxiety because under the planned economy, if a student could finish a 4-year course, they were pretty much guaranteed a job and a residency in big cities. But after this market economy emerged, so the government began assigning fewer and fewer jobs to the students. And the rumor had it that starting from the 1990s, the government would completely stop assigning jobs to college graduates. So the students had worked very hard to get into their dream schools, and suddenly the rules of the game changed. So I think that's the major source of their anger and grief.
Now, also, there were now foreign companies doing business in China. Explain how that contributed towards students' insecurity.
Yeah, and I think because I don't think that's what all the students thought this way, but some students thought foreign trade was a source of corruption, because there were this group of people called bureaucratic profiteers. So what they did was that they bought products on the planned economy by the price mandated by the government, and they sold the products on the market for whatever the market could pay for. So, and in the 1980s, all the foreign trade was controlled by the government, and the bureaucratic profiteers, they were the group of people who had connections with government officials. So foreign trade was pretty much controlled by these bureaucratic
So
profiteers.
you basically, a foreign company had to employ somebody Chinese through an organization called FESCO,
Yes, yes.
right? And
Yeah,
then it was like an agency or whatever, and they would take their cut of
yeah,
whatever the salaries would be. Now,
yeah.
at the time of Tiananmen, you had your first job. You were working for Canon, which was a Japanese company,
Uh-huh.
right? But you were not employed through FESCO. They did something else to
Yeah,
do an
yeah,
end run around that bureaucracy.
yeah. That's right. So my Japanese boss, and he was very smart. So he thought of this way to get around the rules. He the Canon formed a joint venture with Beijing University, and I belonged to Beijing University at the time. So they hired me through this joint venture. So that's how they got around from the fiscal regulation.
A joint venture, right? They just created another way of employing you.
Yeah.
So that created a lot of tension that students felt unrest about. Some of the things students wanted were kind of silly. They wanted movies and popcorn and things like that too. There was a little bit of that. Did you think that the protests were organized? Were
Uh,
students particularly,
yeah,
good
yeah,
at protesting?
yeah. In a way, the protest was organized. That's true. But I thought that they were poorly organized. So it's kind of anarchy.
Sure. Well, they were students. So there were many protests before we got to Tiananmen Square, but there was one particular event that sparked the Tiananmen Square
Mhm.
massacre, and that was the death of a party leader.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. His name is Hu Yaobang.
Oh, I'm glad you said it. I didn't know how to pronounce it. And he was the former general secretary of a central party, and he
Hmm.
had been very tolerant of freedoms and of student behavior, even
Yeah,
like rock music was permitted
yeah.
under him. So why did his death spark Tiananmen Square?
I think at the time there were three fractions among the highest officials of Communist Party of China. We call them radical reformists, uh, mild reformists, and the conservatives. The radical reformists wanted not only to reform the economy, but also want to reform the political system. The mild, or centrist, the centrists wanted only to reform the economic system, but didn't want to reform the political system. The conservatives wanted neither of them. Hu Yaobang belonged to the radical reformists. So he was very loved by the students because he was kind of pro-democracy, and the students wanted democracy. They wanted the freedom of press. They wanted freedom of speech. They wanted the freedom to assembly. So when Hu Yaobang died, Hu Yaobang, 2 years before he died, he was kind of forced out of his office. So students felt for him. So when the information of his death spread, the students felt that he had been wrongly treated. So they started this protest.
I see. They wouldn't have their protector or their champion any longer. Now, after the funeral of Hu Yaobang, I don't know if I'm saying that right, students begged Peng to speak with
Mm-hmm.
them,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
they bowed to him. Why
yeah.
was that remarkable?
I think, but I had a different opinion about that because the students wanted to have a dialogue with the highest official of the Communist Party, and they wanted their opinion to be heard. So that's why they desperately asked for the dialogue, and they uh, to a certain point they even knelt on the steps of the building as because they wanted to show how desperate they want their voice to be heard. And but I had different opinion about that. I think democracy is about a set of process. It's if the student wanted to speak with Peng, and Peng just stepped out, So I didn't think that's democracy, how democracy operated. So that's why I wrote about my own feeling in the book.
What I'm trying to understand, though, how did Li Peng respond to the students' demands? He seemed to be pretty open to talking with students.
I think he was no he at first he refused to talk with students, but after because students started a hunger strike, and that gave Li Peng pressure. So finally, he agreed to talk with students. Yeah, but there was only one time that he agreed to talk with students. So
Okay.
throughout the process, I think he was pretty much arrogant.
Okay. But he said, or at least I got the feeling from what you wrote, that he recognized the protests as patriotic rather than counter-revolutionary. In other words, he didn't take it as a big threat. Maybe he was being patronizing, but he kind of, acquiesced that he would talk with the students. And I think you said he agreed to some of the students' demands.
Yeah. And but he also threatened that if the student couldn't maintain the orders, the government would maintain order with force. So that's very ominous. I think at the time when I heard his remarks from TV, I thought it's very ominous.
So he was not being as agreeable as it seemed at first.
Yeah, I don't think so.
What made him declare martial law?
I think that's I, I don't know, but Li Peng published a diary, so I think he wrote about the process of the decision making.
Of making it, because that was kind of the line in the sand, right? That was on June 3rd, 1989, at 10 a.m. in the morning, he declared martial law. And that really set the sides apart, where the students were already in Tiananmen Square, but that's where we saw the horrific acts take place from what we saw. Now, you were taking photos of events in Tiananmen Square at that time. What happened to those photos?
Yeah, my grandmother destroyed all the photos, so that's very sad, and that's why I broke up with my grandmother in a very hurtful way.
Well, didn't you also say that your Canon bosses shredded photos as well?
Yeah. My boss asked me to shred the photos, so I secretly put some in my backpack and took it back home.
I see. Do you know if anybody else was taking photos?
A lot of people.
They were taking photos, because we saw some video feeds and some photos, certainly.
Yeah.
But I wondered if the government stepped in to confiscate photos.
Yeah, at the time, camera was very rare, and the films were very expensive. So I think the foreign journalist was the major source who took photos.
Right. I mean, this was before digital photos were prevalent.
Yeah.
Right, and you had to use film, and it had to be developed.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of an obstacle to doing that. Now, I remember you said your grandmother took all of your notes. You had all kinds of notes. How did you recall all the details when you sat down to write this book? If you didn't have your notes, she had destroyed all of those as well as the photos.
So the major part of writing this book is to dig deeply into my own memory, and also I checked the books. Some other the former activists, they have some books. They have written some books. So I checked the books and correlate my memory with the dates and the accounts of the events in the books. So
okay, so you used other sources as well. Now,
yeah.
you never joined the protest yourself.
No, I never joined the protest myself. I wasn't a protester. So I wrote this book from the perspective of a witness.
Do you
I
feel
was a bystander.
do you feel remorse about not joining the protests? Did you feel conflicted?
Not really, because I had this mixed feeling, and because on one hand, I I I just graduated from college a couple of months ago, so I still had the spirit of a student in me. So I felt naturally for the student cause. But on the other hand, I was an employee of this foreign company. When the protest first started, my Japanese boss was very concerned because Canon was just about to build its first ever assembly plant in China. So he was afraid that the investment, the radical change of the political scenarios would affect Canon's investment. So that's why he sent me to Tiananmen Square to take photos, because he wanted to analyze what this protest would take the people, which direction China was going to go. So I knew that the Canon's project could have been affected. So I kind of worried. So I learned about one detail when I heard students sing the international would unite human race. I felt so worried because I knew that song was from the back alley rising of Paris Commune. And the Paris Commune was regarded as the example of proletariat by the Karl Marx. So Karl Marx thought Paris Commune was the dictatorship of proletariat. So I was very worried because I didn't want a society of the dictatorship of proletariat. I wanted a society consists of middle class people because I wanted to be a member of middle class. So I had this mixed feeling when watching the protests ongoing. So
I understand. Oh, I take no judgment of that. I mean, I can only, I think from reading your book, I have a very clear feeling of how torturous this had to be. It's not an easy situation. Do we know how many people perished in Tiananmen Square?
Until this day, we don't have an exact number, but we estimate it's around 300.
Who actually died?
Yeah.
I mean, we all saw the horrific acts of what you call Tank Man, and that it shocked the world, and there were lots of repercussions. Let's talk about that. Describe the aftermath of Tiananmen Square. Did protests spread to the public?
No, I think after the violent crackdown on June 3rd, so the protests pretty much stopped.
Was the public terrified?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Now, there was lots of international reaction to Tiananmen Square. The Japanese prime minister condemned the action, and Japanese banks and businesses were then attacked for their action. And many Japanese businessmen fled back to Japan from China. Bush Sr., who was the United States president at the time, declared economic sanctions against China, and 7 European countries followed suit. The World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and others froze China's line of credit. Did that must have brought trade to a standstill in China?
Yeah. That was a very difficult time for China and for average citizens.
Did it make China change its policies in any way? Or did it just go away?
Yeah, I think China survived that.
It survived that, so it didn't cause any political upheaval where anybody rethought what they were doing. But there were some significant events just after Tiananmen Square. 1 month later, Solidarity in Poland succeeded, right? And 5 months later, the Berlin Wall fell. Do you see a connection to Tiananmen Square by those events?
Yeah, I think so. Because I at the time I was very jealous because I thought uh, we were living in this oppressed society, but our fight had flew elsewhere. So I think it has close relation with with the crackdown of the Tiananmen protest, because people in other communist country thought that communists didn't work.
It didn't work, but student protests stopped. There were
Yeah.
no further student protests. And the freedom of speech that China students and public gained in the 80s was completely quelled.
Yeah.
Right? People didn't feel free to speak out anymore. But the irony is that as the political life closed down, the economic situation improved.
Yeah.
So what happened? I mean, I guess that's further, nails in the coffin of any further protest for political freedom.
Yeah. So, I feel amazed. Till this day, I didn't know how people wrap their heads around so quickly. So, one of my Japanese boss theory is that the Tiananmen protests stemmed from people's longing for democracy and their fear for market economy. But suddenly, people did not fear about market economy anymore, and they plunged themselves wholeheartedly into this pursuit of money, and in a brazen way. So,
Right. Well, you talk about what it was like for the middle class to arise, and you even talked about your experience living in the suburbs. What an unhappy experience that was for you, how materialistic everybody had become, and critical and judgmental of each other, where the solidarity that people formerly felt in China to help neighbors and such was diminished. And suddenly there was competitiveness. Before we move on, we have only a minute left. What happened to the leaders of the Tiananmen Square Rebellion?
I know some of the leaders. They are living in the United States now. I think they are still fighting for their cause. They're still finding ways to fight for China to become a democratic country.
But fighting from another land.
Yes, yes.
Now, you emigrated to the United States through a very circuitous route. You went to New Zealand, you went to Canada, and wound up in the United States. And you say that most of your friends wound up in the United States as well. Do you long to return to China?
Yeah, I still, because in the past years, I still went back to China like once a year. So I still have family there. I visited China once a year. But after this book, I don't know if I still allowed to go back to China anymore. Because we have a WeChat, it's a Chinese social media, but my WeChat account was blocked because this book, because I advertised my book using WeChat, so my WeChat account was blocked.
Well, Anna, thank you so much for talking with us. I hope you do get to return to China. Let's talk again, and I'd like to, maybe we'll do a Skype from China. Do you think that would probably not likely, right?
I'm looking forward to it.
All right, Anna, thank you so much for being my guest. Stay right where you are. And to our viewers at home, thank you so much for listening. I'm Alice Bloom. We'll see you next time.